Daniel Cross never asked for much. A quiet dockside job, a small apartment with a view of the harbor, and enough steady work to keep his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, in shoes that fit and lunches she didn't have to be embarrassed about. That was all he needed. The days of steel decks, salt-sprayed uniforms, and orders barked over a roaring sea were long behind him. At least, that's what he told himself every morning when he knotted his worn work boots and walked to the marina. Emily loved the docks. She loved the way the gulls wheeled overhead, the smell of diesel mixed with seaweed, and the rows of boats tied like obedient horses to their berths. Daniel loved it for an entirely different reason. No one here asked questions. A man who kept his head down and worked hard didn't have to explain where he came from or why he carried himself with the quiet alertness of someone who'd spent too long in dangerous places. That morning had been like any other, until a voice he didn't recognize called his name. "Mr. Cross? Daniel Cross?" He turned to see a man in a crisp white polo with a yacht club emblem stitched over the chest. The stranger's smile was polite but measured, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. He explained that Miranda Hale, the new owner of the Hale Crest yacht anchored just offshore, was hosting a private afternoon cruise. A few of the dockhands had been invited as a goodwill gesture, a chance to mingle with the city's wealthiest guests, enjoy the sun, and remind everyone that good people still built the foundation of this harbor. Daniel almost said no. The last thing he needed was to stand out among strangers with sharp suits and sharper eyes. But when Emily overheard and begged to go, her face bright as sunrise, his resolve softened. He told himself it would just be a few hours, a chance for her to see the kind of boats she drew in her notebooks. A rare afternoon of laughter, nothing more. By noon, father and daughter were stepping barefoot onto polished teak, surrounded by men and women who smelled of expensive cologne and barely glanced their way. Emily clung to his hand at first, but her awe soon took over. She skipped from rail to rail, pointing out gulls, fishing trawlers, and the way the city skyline faded into blue haze behind them. Daniel stayed near the stern, content to watch. But whispers drifted through the warm air, too quiet for Emily to catch. Not too quiet for him. "Dockhand, isn't he? Look at that jacket." "Single dad, I heard. Can't even find a sitter?" "Who brings a kid out here?" Daniel felt the old weight settle between his shoulders, the one he thought he'd left on distant seas. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, pretending not to hear. Emily glanced up once, puzzled by his silence, but he forced a smile. As the yacht glided farther from the harbor, the chatter turned lazy, glasses clinked, and Miranda Hale herself made an appearance. She was every inch the image of grace and power, tailored white dress, a voice that carried without effort. She thanked her guests for coming, barely glancing at Daniel before moving on. To her, he was just part of the scenery, and that suited him fine. But far out on the horizon, a gray silhouette was cutting through the glittering water. Not another yacht, not a fishing boat. Larger, sharper, moving fast. Daniel's breath caught, though he said nothing. Years of training told him before his mind caught up. This wasn't coincidence. A Navy destroyer was approaching their course. Emily tugged his sleeve, wide-eyed. "Daddy, that's a warship." Daniel swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "Yeah, kiddo. Sure is." What he didn't say, ships like that didn't just wander close to pleasure cruises. They had purpose, and if the captain really was who Daniel thought it might be. He felt every curious glance as the gray vessel loomed closer, cutting across their path. And then, to his horror and Emily's delight, the destroyer slowed. Its captain stepped out onto the bridge wing, raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute, straight at Daniel Cross. The yacht fell utterly silent. For a heartbeat, Daniel didn't move. Old instincts told him to acknowledge the salute, to return it as he had 1,000 times before. But those days were over. He clenched his fists at his sides and stared fixedly at the deck, as if willing the destroyer to pass them by without further incident. But Emily had no such instincts to hold her back. Her small hand shot up, waving wildly at the massive ship towering over them. "Daddy, they're waving at us," she cried, her voice bubbling with pride. The guests murmured in confusion. A few shaded their eyes, trying to see who the Navy officer's salute was meant for. The angle left no doubt. It was not for the yacht, not for its wealthy owner, but for the quiet man in the worn jacket standing near the stern. Miranda Hale herself stepped forward, brows knit in surprise. "Mr. Cross, do you know that ship?" Daniel didn't answer. His pulse thundered in his ears, and every muscle in his body screamed to get off this boat, to vanish before the questions began. But Emily tugged on his arm, her face glowing with excitement. "They're saluting you, Daddy. Why are they saluting you?" He forced a smile down at her, though his throat felt tight. "Just an old friend saying hello," he murmured. It was the closest thing to the truth he could give her in front of these people. The destroyer held its position for several long seconds, the salute unwavering before the captain lowered his hand and the massive ship glided past in silence, engines thrumming deep in the water. When it disappeared over the horizon, conversation erupted on the yacht like a shaken bottle uncorked. Who is he? Was he Navy? Why would a destroyer single him out like that? Daniel wanted nothing more than to melt into the wood beneath his boots, but Emily's chest was puffed up with pride. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Her father, not just the man who packed her lunches and patched up her scraped knees, but someone bigger, someone mysterious. Miranda Hale approached him, heels clicking against the deck, her polished composure sharpened into curiosity. "Mr. Cross, I don't believe we've had a proper introduction. You seem to have made quite an impression on some very important people." Daniel kept his voice even. "Just a misunderstanding." "Doesn't look like one," Miranda replied smoothly. "I've hosted senators, business magnates, even an admiral or two. I've never had a Navy destroyer salute my guests." He gave a tight smile, saying nothing more. But silence only made him more intriguing. By the time the yacht returned to harbor, whispers followed Daniel like a wake. Some guests were polite, others openly bold with their questions. Emily held his hand, head high, thrilled by the attention he tried so hard to avoid. But when they stepped off the gangway and the dock came back under his feet, Daniel exhaled as if surfacing from deep water. He thought it was over. He thought the curious looks would fade once the yacht crowd went back to their marble kitchens and glass towers. He was wrong. The next morning, Daniel arrived at work to find two men in dark suits waiting by the marina office. They weren't police. They weren't dock inspectors, and they didn't look like people who came to ask politely. "Mr. Cross," the taller one said, offering no handshake. "We need to talk. Privately." Emily was still half asleep in his truck, her head tipped against the window. Daniel glanced toward her, then back at the men. Old instincts woke up sharp and cold. "About what?" he asked carefully. The shorter man smiled without warmth. "About who you really are." Daniel's first thought was to stall. Buy time, figure out who these men were, what they really wanted. His second thought was to get Emily as far away as possible. "I've got work to do," he said evenly, keeping his voice casual. "If it's important, you can call me." The tall man stepped forward, blocking his path. "We're not here to make appointments, Mr. Cross. This won't take long." Daniel's eyes flicked toward his truck where Emily still slept, oblivious. His pulse quickened. He lowered his voice. "You need to move. Now." Something in his tone, cold, precise, unmistakably military, made both men hesitate just long enough for him to sidestep. He opened the driver's door, slid behind the wheel, and turned the engine over with practiced calm. Emily stirred, blinking awake. "Daddy, are we late?" she mumbled. "No, kiddo, just an early start," he said, forcing a smile. In the rearview mirror, the two men were still watching as he pulled away from the marina. They didn't try to stop him, but Daniel knew this wasn't over. People like that didn't just drop by. That afternoon, Daniel drove Emily to school, then sat in his truck long after she disappeared inside. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to ache. It had been years since anyone came looking for him. He'd walked away from his career, from the Navy, from everything that came with it. No medals, no ceremony, just gone. The salute on the destroyer, the men at the dock. It was no coincidence. Someone had noticed him again. When his phone buzzed, Daniel nearly ignored it, but the caller ID made his chest tighten. Mark Devereux, an old friend, a name he hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "Danny," the familiar voice said when he answered, "you're hard to track down." "I like it that way." "I figured, but when a destroyer tips its hat to you in front of half the city's rich crowd, people start asking questions. Listen, you need to be careful. There's chatter moving through the old channels." Daniel's jaw clenched. "What kind of chatter?" "Not the friendly kind. Someone's digging into your file, and they're not Navy." By evening, Daniel picked up Emily from school and took her for ice cream, trying to keep things normal. She chattered happily about her day, about the yacht, about the huge warship that had saluted them. "Daddy, why did they do that? Were you important?" Daniel smiled faintly, though his heart twisted. "Not important, kiddo. Just part of a big team once." "Did you save people? Like a hero?" He looked down at her, at the chocolate smudged on her cheek. She had no idea what kind of missions he'd done, what kind of things he wished he could forget. "Something like that," he murmured. She grinned proudly, utterly unaware of the weight in his voice. That night, after tucking Emily into bed, Daniel sat in the darkened kitchen with the phone in his hand, staring at it as though it might answer the questions burning in his mind. He knew two things for certain. 1. Whoever those men were, they weren't done. 2. Staying invisible was no longer an option. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. Not a neighbor. Too late for that. Not friendly. Daniel crossed the living room in 3 silent steps and peered through the peephole. Miranda Hale stood outside, alone, dressed in an elegant coat that didn't belong on this side of town. When he opened the door, her smile was thin, cautious. "Mr. Cross, I think we need to talk. May I come in?" Daniel stepped aside reluctantly, letting Miranda into the small apartment. The elegant coat and polished heels looked jarringly out of place against his scuffed floors and second-hand furniture. Miranda, however, didn't seem to notice. She walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been told no. "I'll keep this short," she said, glancing around as though cataloging the life of a man she'd clearly underestimated. "You caused quite a stir yesterday. People are still talking." Daniel folded his arms. "About what?" "About who you really are." Her eyes were sharp, searching. "That destroyer didn't salute you by mistake. And then this morning, 2 rather unfriendly men came sniffing around the marina. Not my kind of people. They were looking for you." Daniel felt the old weight pressing against his chest again. "Did you tell them anything?" "I told them I didn't know you," which apparently is true, but I don't like unanswered questions. Miranda's voice softened, curiosity edged with something he couldn't read. Concern, maybe, or just fascination. "Who are you, Mr. Cross?" "Really?" Daniel looked past her toward Emily's closed bedroom door. "Just a father," he said. "That's all I need to be." Miranda tilted her head, unsatisfied. "You don't get saluted like that for being just a father." The silence stretched until Miranda broke it with an unexpected shift in tone. "Look, I'm not your enemy. I don't care about your past, not unless it puts you or that little girl in danger, and right now, it seems like it might." That caught Daniel's attention. He'd expected judgment, maybe condescension. Not this. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. "I've spent enough time around powerful people to recognize the look of someone being hunted. The 2 men who came this morning, they weren't curious. They were worried. She hesitated, then added, "And I don't think they were working alone." Daniel exhaled slowly. He'd spent years burying his past life, and now it was clawing its way back through strangers' questions and salutes from gray warships. "Do yourself a favor," Miranda said, heading toward the door. "If you've got skeletons in your closet, figure out which ones are rattling before someone else does it for you." That night, Daniel sat awake long after Miranda left. He pulled out an old, battered lockbox from beneath his bed, one Emily had never seen, and turned the key with reluctant fingers. Inside were fragments of a life he'd walked away from: a folded flag, a photograph of his old Navy team, and a single brass coin engraved with an emblem Emily wouldn't recognize but any operator would. He stared at it for a long time before slipping it into his pocket. If someone was coming after him, he needed to know who, and the only person who might have answers was Mark Devereaux, the same man who'd warned him just hours earlier. The next morning, Daniel dropped Emily off at school with an extra-long hug she didn't understand, then drove across the city to an unmarked bar on the waterfront, the kind of place where no one asked questions if you walked in with old scars. Mark was already waiting in a back booth, older than Daniel remembered but still wearing that sly, knowing grin. "Danny Cross," he said, sliding a glass across the table. "The man who vanished." Daniel sat down without touching the drink. "Who's looking for me?" Mark's grin faded. "Someone who remembers what you used to be worth. And they're not the type to knock twice." "Names," Daniel said. "Now." Mark hesitated, then leaned in. "The people sniffing around, they're not Navy. They're private, black contract. And they're not just curious. They're scared. Word is, something you were part of is about to come back up, and they think you know more than you should." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I walked away. I'm out." "Danny," Mark said quietly, "men like you are never out." "Not really." Back at school, Emily waited on the steps for her father, unaware of the shadow moving closer. A dark sedan parked across the street, engine idling. A man in a suit watched her from behind tinted glass, phone pressed to his ear. Emily swung her feet on the school steps, humming to herself, unaware of the dark sedan idling across the street. The afternoon sun painted everything golden, the kind of peaceful scene Daniel Cross had tried to build his whole life around. But peace doesn't last when someone else is digging up your past. Daniel arrived on foot, scanning the street before Emily even spotted him. Years of instinct, a quick glance at reflections in windows, noting which cars were running, which faces lingered too long. He saw the sedan immediately, the same two men from the marina. Emily jumped up and ran to him, backpack bouncing. "Daddy," she chirped, wrapping her arms around his waist. Daniel hugged her back, keeping his eyes on the sedan. It didn't move, but the rear window lowered 2 inches, and a camera lens glinted in the sun. "Emily, get in the truck," he said softly, steering her toward the curb. She looked up, puzzled. "No questions, kiddo. Just move." As he buckled her into the passenger seat, the sedan's doors opened. Both men stepped out. The tall one, square shoulders, sharp jaw. The shorter one with eyes that darted like a jackal's. They crossed the street slowly, confidently, as if certain Daniel wouldn't make a scene with children around. "Mr. Cross," the tall man called. "We just want to talk." Daniel closed Emily's door, his own heartbeat steady now. Danger always slowed him down. "I told you yesterday, I'm not interested." The shorter man smiled like this was a game. "We're not asking." Daniel stepped away from the truck, drawing them farther from Emily. "You picked the wrong place." "Actually," the tall man said calmly, "we picked the right one. You care about that little girl, which means you're going to listen." Daniel moved faster than either of them expected. One step forward, sharp and sudden, and he shoved the shorter man back against a parked car with a forearm to the chest. The tall man's hand dipped inside his jacket, a mistake, because Daniel's grip was already on his wrist before he could draw. "You listen to me," Daniel said, voice low, deadly calm. "You come near my daughter again, and I will make you regret breathing." For a second, the street froze, passing parents staring, children pointing, not understanding what they were seeing. The tall man tried to twist free, but Daniel didn't move an inch. His strength was controlled, precise, a soldier's strength, not a thug's. "Easy," the shorter man hissed, hands raised. "We just want to know what you remember about Bahrain, about Operation Seafire." The words hit Daniel like a cold wave. Seafire, a classified mission buried years ago, something he'd promised himself never to think about again. "I remember walking away," Daniel growled, releasing the man's wrist. "And I suggest you do the same." They backed off, but not far. The taller man straightened his jacket, eyes narrow. "This isn't over, Cross. You're not the only one who cares about that kid." As the sedan pulled away, Daniel climbed into the truck, forcing a smile for Emily, who'd seen everything. "Daddy, why were those men mad at you?" she asked softly. "They weren't mad, kiddo. Just confused." He tried to make his voice light. "But they won't bother us again." Emily looked unconvinced. "You promise?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "I promise." But even as he said it, he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. That night, after putting Emily to bed, Daniel met Miranda Hale again, this time at her insistence. She'd heard about the confrontation at the school from someone in her circle. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly, sitting across from him in the dimly lit corner of a cafe. "Whatever they think you know, they won't walk away empty-handed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then I'll give them nothing." Miranda studied him for a long moment. "Daniel, you're good at hiding. I can see that. But if this keeps escalating, you're not just hiding from them. You're hiding from your daughter, too. Sooner or later, she's going to find out who you really are." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to, because his phone vibrated on the table. No name, just a single message. "We have her backpack. Next time it'll be her." Daniel stared at the message on his phone until the words blurred. A single image followed, Emily's backpack lying on the hood of a black sedan. No threats, no demands, just a promise of what came next. Miranda saw his face harden. "What is it?" "They've made their last mistake," Daniel said, rising from the table. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the cold certainty of a man who'd been here before. Daniel drove straight to the marina where the Hale Crest yacht had docked again for the weekend, and where Miranda knew the men were likely to appear. He sent one text to Mark Devereux. "Keep eyes on Emily. Don't let her out of your sight." Then he disappeared into the shadows of the pier, slipping back into the soldier he thought he'd buried years ago. By the time the black sedan arrived, Daniel was ready. He watched the two men step out, glancing around as if they owned the night. They didn't see him until it was too late. The shorter man barely had time to draw his weapon before Daniel disarmed him with a single twist of the wrist and sent the gun skidding into the water. The tall man swung wildly. Trained, yes, but not like Daniel. Every movement Daniel made was controlled, precise, and efficient. In under 10 seconds, both men were pinned against the side of the pier, breathless and wide-eyed. "You wanted to talk," Daniel said calmly, pressing the tall man's arm until he winced. "So talk. Who sent you?" The shorter man coughed. "We just take orders. Private contract. They want to know what you remember about Bahrain, about Seafire." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Seafire was shut down. Buried. "Not anymore," the man gasped. "Something's resurfacing. People are nervous. They think you're the loose end." Daniel stepped back, letting them breathe. "You tell whoever sent you, I'm not their loose end. I'm the man who ends things." The message was clear. Both men scrambled back into their car and tore out of the marina, not looking back. When Daniel returned home, Mark was sitting on the porch with Emily, who was curled up asleep on his shoulder, her backpack safely beside her. Mark gave a knowing grin. I'm guessing it's handled. For now, Daniel said quietly, lifting Emily into his arms. But this isn't over. Someone out there thinks I know something. They'll keep looking. Mark shrugged. Then maybe it's time to remind them why they saluted you in the first place. The next day, life almost looked normal again. Emily woke to the smell of pancakes, blissfully unaware of how close danger had come. She asked no questions about her missing backpack. Daniel told her it had simply been found by a friend at the marina. She accepted the story easily, though her father's watchful eyes stayed sharper than ever. As they sat by the window eating breakfast, a Navy destroyer moved slowly across the distant horizon. Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. Emily spotted it first. "Daddy, look, another warship." Daniel smiled faintly, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, kiddo, big one. Do you think they're looking for you again?" she asked innocently. Daniel shook his head. "Number not this time. But if they are, I'm ready." He didn't tell her the truth, that the salute wasn't just respect, it was a warning to the people chasing him, a message that Daniel Cross was not a man to be cornered. As the destroyer slid past on the horizon, Daniel held his daughter close. The world might come calling again. His past might knock on the door, but no matter who came, no matter what they wanted, there was one line he would never let anyone cross. No one would ever take Emily from him. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like he was hiding. He felt like himself again. The man the Navy had once trusted with the hardest missions. The man strangers saluted at sea. The man his daughter already thought he was.